There is too much to cover about hip-hop. There's no honest way I can get through I can't get through a single decade of hip-hop in 1.5 hours. It's just impossible. Hip-hop is one of those genres that actually actively tries to incorporate everything. These are kind of like major categories. By poetry, I'm talking about kind of like the spoken word poetry of the 70s.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Stag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
That was 1970, Gil Scott-Heron. Together with all of these other genres, rock music, soul and funk definitely are huge sources of the hip-hop sound, but also the most popular music on records of the day, disco, right? All of this stuff is out there in the 70s, yeah?
Was that track, was it Gil Scott-Heron who picked out the samples or did the instrumentals behind it?
It's a real band.
Okay.
It is. I mean, it's probably a studio recording, so I know the band probably performed it and then he might have recorded his vocals later. But he could totally have done that in a jazz club, a poetry slam or something, right? That's what that recording is. It's a real band. It's more of a jazz tradition, I guess, if you think about it, a upright bass or electric bass. It sounded like a flute and, of course, a drummer. There might have been bongos in there. I'm not quite sure. I wasn't hearing that closely. And there's other groups. The Last Poets was another well-known group. Of course, people were also going to see them live. Hip-hop has 4 or 5 pillars. The 5th pillar being knowledge and kind of like incorporates everything because it's just about knowing your history. It's kind of a construct. This idea of there are 4 pillars of hip-hop is actually a little bit of clever marketing. In the modern conception of what hip-hop was in the 70s and in the 80s, these 4 pillars do come up a lot. Graffiti was definitely there first. Folks call it writing. It influenced the visual aspect of the hip-hop culture all the way through fashion and, of course, the murals, graffiti tags in public areas, in private areas. That already existed long before any of the musical components of hip-hop. That's why I kind of like put it up over there. Logically, the DJs sort of come next, but I think it's a little bit questionable whether the breakdancers came first or the DJs came first. The story is that when DJs played records, when the music hit a break, and you all know what a break is at this point, people will do these dances to them, these very high energy dances known as breaking or breakdancing. And there's a bunch of different subcategories of breakdancing. And DJs will find ways to extend those breaks so that the breakdancers could have more time. The people who wanted to breakdance were putting all of their effort into dancing at those times. It was a spectacle, something for other people to look at. So it's questionable which one actually came first. Some things like pop locking definitely came before DJs in hip-hop. But of course, those records had to exist for them to pop lock too. It's somewhat robotic movements, probably before the 70s. There's some films where there's something that looks like pop lock in there. Footwork exists in all forms of dance, of course. Up rockers are very much more aggressive, sort of take up space kind of moves. Floor work is what most people are familiar with when it comes to breakdancing, where people actually get down to the floor and actually spin or do some sort of vaults or freeze in midair with their legs in the air and their hands on the ground or something like that. Power moves are extremely athletic in order to be able to perform those moves. Even though I mix into hip-hop style, I'm not 100% comfortable calling myself a hip-hop DJ. Because hip-hop's a culture that incorporates all of this. I'm at best a visitor, like a tourist to this culture. I will say that when I was much younger, I was a breakdancer, like much shorter and closer to the ground. At that time, maybe I was a little bit more hip-hop. So even though I mix in the hip-hop style, I am not claiming any membership in the hip-hop culture. I'm just trying to represent it the best I can in front of you, all right? Once you've got DJs trying to figure out ways to extend breaks, which are mostly instrumental parts, you get people who can speak on top of them, people who can perform this sort of poetry, whether it rhymes or not, but some sort of poetry that goes with the groove on top of that. And that's largely where you see genres of hip-hop start to differentiate themselves. From the very first, what folks call old school now, to all of the different generational and regional styles of hip-hop, it's usually split up in terms of how the rap sounds, how the rhyme schemes work, also the vibe of the beats, but mostly lyrical and regional. I can't speak about this with the level of detail in which it needs to be described, but I can talk about the DJ side of things. So let me play a break. James Brown is always good. In this year, in August, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip-hop. 50 years from the first party in 1973, where a DJ named DJ Kool Herc decided to try something new. And he actually told everybody who came to this party in the recreational room in 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx in New York that he was going to try something new. He was going to play records in a different way than he'd been doing it in the past. Now, he is what we would today call a mobile DJ, but he had a whole crew of people to help him move his gear around. He had giant speakers, and he'd drive them around in his open-top convertible because they wouldn't fit in any other vehicle. At that time, the technology that he was working with was actually mostly guitar technology. Yeah, he had turntables plugged into guitar amps, but it wasn't like the hi-fi systems that you would get from the disco DJs of that same period of time. We're talking about pretty much the same era as disco. Remember the disco, we were talking in 1971 and we went into like the early 80s. Now we're talking about 1973, so we're barely into the first couple of years of disco here. Now this isn't disco, this is funk. You don't have that 4 to the floor beat, it's very much more syncopated. Super high energy. He told people that he's going to just play breaks and see how people enjoy them. Now, he didn't have a way to be able to actually hear what's going on, just like me right now, because I left my headphones in my bag. I'll go and grab them shortly. But right now, this is basically what it will sound like. This is the start of the break. 4, 3, 2, 1. That's the break. 4 bars. And then he played the next song. This is what he'd do. He'd play little snippets of each song. And then at the end he just played tracks. He just played tracks going from break to break to break. And he called that the merry-go-round. Little short 4-bar segments, maybe 8 bars, depending on how long the break on the records were. And people really enjoyed it. There was no real beat matching. There was no real even dropping on the one. It was a back-to-school party, by the way, because it was August 11th or something. It was thrown by his sister trying to raise money for back-to-school supplies. They just had it in this rec room of this large apartment complex. That's what people nowadays remember as the beginning of hip-hop. Some of that history is still contested. There are DJs who are saying we were basically playing exactly the same songs that you were playing places like Brooklyn. People are usually quite happy to say hip-hop's 50 years old now. The Mexican, I'm going to keep playing this a little bit longer. It's really a rock song. Yeah, here we go. This is just rock, right? We've got funk music, we've got rock. Eventually we'll get a little bit more 60s soul, but this is what was popular at the time in the 70s, so this was what DJs were playing. And hip-hop DJs were just finding a different way to play the same records that people already recognized and already loved. Now I've talked a little bit about German cosmic music, kosmische Musik. Just like the disco DJs, the hip-hop crowds were also into those same tracks. Although not everyone could get their hands on those records. These are all imports from Europe. So you had to know someone, you had to be very well connected to record stores, and you had to know what you were looking for, right? There we go. It's got a pretty good beat. And it's about the same tempo as some of those other songs that I was playing earlier. Another DJ in the Bronx called Africa Bambaataa, he was actually involved in gangs at the time, but people were getting hurt in like gang fights. He was also a DJ, and he noticed that when people resolved their issues by dance battles, everyone went home alive and unhurt. You know, well, maybe there was a little bit of injury if you're pulling some breaking power move or something and you fall on your head, but that's self-inflicted. He was actively trying to get gangs to resolve their differences through music rather than through violence. He created this organization that he calls the Zulu Nation. I want you to hear this part. And itself, it's kind of run like a gang, but it very much is built around this whole idea of we're a gang that exists to make music. It's okay for you to be aggressive. Some of these dance battles are very aggressive. Breakdancing is physically aggressive, but it's not violent. It's not intended to hurt people, except maybe emotionally, right? Here's another track. I mean, one would argue this sounds more like techno. The beat is not the same, but the tempo is. He builds up enough fame and resources doing these DJ parties, organizing these events, that he can make his own music as well, right? Based on the kind of music that he sees getting a good response from the audience and the stuff that just inspires him. One of the people is Arthur Baker, who is actually a Boston native who moved over to New York. And he makes his own version of these Kraftwerk records with his rappers, which he calls the Soul Sonic Force.
Party people, still yo get funky. Still Sonic Force, still yo get funky. Those Zulu Nation, still yo get funky. Yeah, just hit me.
You can hear the combination of the influences. So that's a direct reference to Kraftwerk, right there. It's like a mashup of two Kraftwerk songs, actually, but then they're rapping on top of it, and they're adding additional sounds on top of that. This is kind of like the first branch away from hip-hop, which is what we now call electro, but at the time, they were just called it hip-hop. There were so many people doing experiments of different styles of what hip-hop could be, so it would have been considered just part of hip-hop. But nowadays, we recognize this sound more as electro. Planet Rock was the song, when it came out in 1982, that you would hear in every car driving down the street in the Bronx. People just started making more and more records that sounded like Planet Rock. And then eventually, that subgenre is just called electro. So far, I've been talking about DJ Kool Herc, figured out the whole breaks idea. There is Africa Bambaataa, who is bringing in this more electronic influence and has a much larger library of records to sort of bring and add to what is the sound of hip-hop. And finally, we get to Grandmaster Flash. So I'm going to play a song that would have been played by quite a number of DJs at the time, including Africa Bambaataa and Kool Herc, which is Bob James' Take Me to the Mardi Gras. He's a jazz pianist, I think. And this is actually a cover of a Paul Simon song called Take Me to the Mardi Gras. This is his jazz version of it. Okay, we got this like massive break at the beginning of the song, and then it gets kind of easy listening after that, right? It's funky, but it's, you know, this is like sip a cocktail music, not like breakdance music. We already have Kool Herc playing a sequence of breaks from different records in order to try to get people to continually dance. Africa Bambaataa is expanding the range of different songs. Grandmaster Flash, he was trying to figure out how to just take one break and make it longer. And for the most part, he did it by dropping. And then he rewind the record, he'd backspin the record back to the beginning. And then mix it up. One of the kids who was inspired by Grandmaster Flash and wanted to learn from Grandmaster Flash, and they would hang out while Grandmaster Flash was practicing, and there was this kid called Theodore, and Flash decided to teach him how to do this. Instead of like using 2 turntables, he only had 1, but he was still able to loop records. I think he was something like 12 years old when he did this. I'll let you hear what that sounds like. I'm moving the needle back 1 groove, 2 grooves at a time. And it's the sort of thing that's a lot easier when you're like 10 and 12 and your hands are like super steady, and now I can't even see the grooves anymore. But that's what he was doing, and that was needle dropping. Now we've got drum and bass, basically. This is the beat that forms drum and bass. That comes much later, you know, in the 90s. The story goes, Theodore was making his own mixtape late at night at home, playing all of the tracks and, you know, cueing on his headphones, just going back to the beginning of the track and doing this. And then his mother apparently burst into the room telling him to turn down the music and being extremely upset at him. And he was doing this while his tape recorder was recording. He was scared, so it's probably more like that. He would then listen to what he had recorded, you know, trying to find a place where he messed up so that he could record from that point onwards. And then he realized, actually, that sounds kind of cool. Who invented scratching is credited to Grand Wizard Theodore, his DJ name. Flash very much quickly incorporated that sound back into how he performed. So I want you to hear a little bit about what Grandmaster Flash was doing. I want to emphasize, majority of these people are teenagers at this point. They're not like 30, 40-year-old seasoned professionals. These are kids, you know, inventing a whole new way of performing music, a whole new sound. So this is what Grandmaster Flash sounds like when he's recording in a studio.
You say, one for the trouble, 2 for the time. Come on, girls, let's rock that. for the trouble, 2 for time. Come on, girls, let's rock that.
Good times. Do you know what song this is? Queen. Another one bites the dust. So that's what he'd do in front of entire audience. While it was clearly an accomplishment and has influenced all of DJing since then, a lot of people didn't know what they were supposed to do while he was mixing like this. They were clearly excited, they were clearly intrigued, but a lot of people would stop dancing because it's like, oh my God, what's going on over there? And I've actually had that happen in clubs. I play a bunch of classic funk tracks or hip hop tracks, and people are dancing, having a great time, and then I start scratching things up, and then everyone stops dancing and starts looking at me, and they're clearly excited. They're waving their hands, but they're not actually dancing as hard as they used to be. And then I kind of pull back a little bit, and I was like, all right, I actually didn't intend to make you stop dancing. And he would describe that, it was like he was teaching a class or something. I did not understand scratching until I realized that it was a problem-solving technique for certain kinds of hip-hop beats. So for instance, take this beat. This is a rock song. Or actually, this is a good example. Okay, this is a well-behaved song because you've got a bunch of bars and then you have the vocals come in, right? Okay, I got 4 clean bars. And I can keep that going forever. If you had a song that's not quite as well behaved, this is soul, a little bit a funky side of soul. All right, so if I just want to take those first beats and make a beat out of it, that's the problem, right? You get that, ladies and gentlemen, there. And now, you don't get that vocal. And once I actually realized this is what the DJs were doing, scratching actually just made sense to me now. You're adding additional drum beats. You're using your hands to do it. You can be pretty expressive. You can have a lot of different sounds come out from different songs. If I go back to that last one that I had, you can actually take a beat and then just chop it up like that, which gets us to the beginning of sampling. Before there were digital devices that could record audio and break it up into little bits, turntables allowed us to chop up sounds in the same way. Maybe not exactly the same way, but achieving very, very similar results. Some DJs will go into production. Some studio folks who weren't DJs but loved hip-hop culture would also produce tracks using those kinds of technologies and those kinds of sounds. But then there were also DJs who got comfortable with this and started to think of the turntable as an instrument, as a musical instrument, instead of thinking of it as a media player, right? It's not just a tool to play other people's sounds. It's a tool for you to make your own music. And you can do it live, you can do it in the studio. Folks started calling that turntablism. Specifically, West Coast DJs first started calling it turntablism over in California. And that's now pretty commonly accepted as a person who uses a turntable as a musical instrument. Some of you might have watched a Shortcuts video, which is linked on the class website. And he goes through like 15 levels of turntablism, starting off with the basic scratches. And we'll get to a few more of those basic scratches on Wednesday. But then as it gets on and on and on, he's making whole beats. He's making whole passages of music out of those basic scratches. And you start to get the sense, yeah, it's a kind of a drum, only it doesn't just have to play drum sounds. You can use any kind of sound. One very, very famous sound comes from this record, Fab 5 Freddy, and B-side, who coincidentally does the B-side, who's a French rapper, that's her, who does the same song, only in French. But right at the end of the French version, we get the sound. The producer saying, this stuff is really, really fresh, and then the engineer feeding it through a device called a vocoder to be able to create this interesting robotic sound. Because it's completely clean of any beats, and it's so harmonically rich, just like it's almost like white noise, but there's actually words in there that you recognize. It becomes a sound that's rich for DJs to scratch over. Starting with the fresh sound. A lot of DJs started with that. It's like fresh. I mean, it's a great sound to add to your music. So they could do that, right? They just scratch fresh over things. And then later on, they realized there's more sounds. It's not just fresh. And the R sound is actually very rich. So the difference is the R sound has a percussive start to it. It goes from 0 to in a fraction of a second. Compare that to the fresh, which goes kind of resh, you know. So both very interesting sounds. The R is a little bit more percussive. And nowadays, if you want to be a scratch DJ, you practice the R first. The R is kind of like the basic strum that you learn on a guitar. It's the first thing. You can always get better at doing it the more you practice. And then once you've done it with this sound, you can then use other sounds from other records, vocal lines, for instance, and cut them up using those same techniques. You're just replacing the sound, but you're using the same hand movements. I've attached 2 pieces of tape to this particular record. One of those pieces is just basically telling me, this is what I want to be pointing at my needle at the beginning of the song. Really, I could probably have done it with just this sticker, like I could just take this one out. Because this one physically bumps my needle into the correct groove. So even though I don't have my headphones right now, I can actually just put the needle on the record and just rewind it until I actually see it bumping against that piece of tape. I think I got it. Yep. And then now I know I'm at the beginning of the song. So that's a hot cue. The original DJ hot cue was actually a crayon. That's what Grandmaster Flash would do. He would have a line going from the center out, and then he'd actually use that crayon to draw the full circle around it. So he'd sort of be able to see the groove. But I find that less exact than this method right now. Some of you might be cringing about the idea of just applying tape onto your records, but this is what hip-hop DJs did. They committed many cardinal sins of DJing and invented a whole new form of mixing at the same time.